They've seen your face.
Then they already know they're too late.
Good. I hired one human, and they look ready to run.
Fear keeps them alive a little longer.
Only a little.
Now they understand why I chose you.
They'll understand one last thing.
Finish it.
The war room in the belly of the sunken palace smelled of burnt relay circuits and something older. Something mineral, like the canyon walls breathing after a long night. Captain Oren stood at the head of the table with his hands flat on its surface, and his expression caught somewhere between fury and a fear he was too disciplined to name. Across from him, head analyst Senna pressed 2 of her 4 fingers to the data slate and rotated the tactical overlay until the last known positions of the 40 Covenant operatives hung in the air between them as red markers, scattered across the palace perimeter like dropped stones. Every single one showed the same timestamp for withdrawal, 3:14 hours. Synchronized. Deliberate, as if someone had pulled them back on a single signal. 40 trained Covenant blades just confirmed his face and pulled back. Oren said, "All 40. In my 30 years serving this throne, I have never once seen the Covenant retreat. Someone tell me who in the gods' names we just hired." Senna said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the markers and thinking about the pattern of their withdrawal, which was not a scramble, not a panic scatter, but a clean, organized retreat, the kind a military unit performed when it received an order it understood completely and did not question. That distinction mattered. This was not fear of being caught. This was the Covenant following a known protocol. Her Majesty hired a human. Senna said carefully, Sergeant Marcus Cole, formerly of the Earth Commonwealth 5th Response Division, current affiliation listed as independent contractor. I know what he is. I need to know why they ran. I don't have that answer yet. Oren straightened and looked at the overlay for another long moment, then shut it down with one hand. Find it, before Chancellor Doral brings this to the morning session and uses it as the axe he's been sharpening since the announcement. Senna gathered her slates and was already moving when she paused at the doorway. Captain! One of the retreating units dropped their relay on the way out. It may have been deliberate. The data is encrypted, but it is recoverable. How long? 2 hours. Maybe 3. You have one. The announcement had been made 3 days earlier, during the noon address, which was the formal daily proceeding at which the Queen of the Vreth Dominion received her court in full assembly. Zaleth had timed it for that hour deliberately. The noon address was broadcast across the entire Dominion on 17 channels. There were, by her communication office's last estimate, approximately 400 million people watching. She had walked to the front of the raised dais with the particular unhurried pace that her advisors called her political walk, not slow, never slow, but measured in a way that communicated absolute absence of urgency. The walk of someone who has already decided and is simply now informing everyone else. She had worn white that day, which on a vreth of her silver scale was a formal signal, the color of executive authority. Her amber eyes had been steady when she faced the assembly. Effective at dawn tomorrow, she had said, the position of first guard to the throne will be held by Sergeant Marcus Cole of Earth. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. In the history of the noon address, Senna had told her afterward, a 4-second silence was unprecedented. Then the hall became a great crashing sound of 400 voices speaking at once. Zaleth had stood perfectly still and let them. Chancellor Doral's voice had carried above the others, not because he had shouted, but because he had the kind of voice trained for resonance in large spaces, rich, layered, built over 4 decades of court proceedings to cut through noise without apparent effort. Your Majesty, a human as first guard. You heard correctly, Chancellor. The tradition of is a tradition I am aware of and have chosen to amend. She had turned her amber gaze to the assembly, slow and sweeping, landing on each cluster of objecting faces for exactly long enough to be registered. This Dominion has hired human contractors for deep space escort work for 20 years. We are the 3rd largest customer of Commonwealth military talent in the outer sectors. We have no philosophical objection to human capability. We have only ever had a question of optics. She had let the word land. I am choosing different optics. What she had not said, what she had said to Senna the night before. In the small anteroom off her private chambers, where she met with the handful of people she actually trusted, was that she needed the conservative faction of the court destabilized. Not permanently. Just enough. They had been blocking her infrastructure expansion bill through procedural obstruction for 3 months, which was 3 months that the lower settlements on Vreth Prime had been waiting for updated water reclamation systems. They are focused on protocol, on tradition, on what has always been done. She had said, I need their attention somewhere else. I need them reactive instead of organized. One decision that violates expectation so completely that for 2 weeks, minimum, they are arguing about optics and symbolism instead of filing procedural challenges. Senna had asked, quietly, who the human was. Zalith had slid a data card across the table. Best available contractor in the outer sectors, according to 2 independent agencies. Former military. The reference notes are, she had paused. They are brief on specifics but consistent on result. He is expensive and he is effective. Senna had taken the data card and looked at the name and had not said anything, because there had not seemed to be anything to say that the Queen would find useful. She had simply filed it and begun preparing the logistics for the arrival. Marcus Cole arrived on the morning of the second day aboard a transport that looked as though it had been through 3 or 4 arguments with various asteroid fields and come out slightly worse each time. He stepped off the boarding ramp into the palace's east landing bay with a single bag over one shoulder and the unhurried walk of a man who was neither impressed nor unimpressed by his surroundings, who was instead simply reading them. He was not what Senna had expected, though she was not entirely certain what she had expected. Medium height, dark hair cut close, a jaw that looked like it had been set wrong after breaking at least once, a burn scar that ran from the back of his left hand up under his sleeve, and another older one at his collarbone visible above his collar. Brown eyes that moved across the landing bay in a pattern Senna recognized as professional exits, sight lines, personnel positions. Architectural choke points, though he performed the assessment with a stillness that made it look like he was simply standing there. Captain Oren had gone to meet him personally, standard protocol for a new first guard, though Senna suspected Oren also wanted his own read on the man before he reached the Queen's quarters. They shook hands. Humans shook hands. Senna had read the reference notes twice and knew this and still found it slightly strange to watch the deliberate contact, the brief grip, the release. Captain Oren, welcome to Vreth Prime. Sergeant Cole, your quarters are... How many people were on the landing bay approach when I came in? Marcus said. It was not a question. He was still looking at the bay. Oren paused. Excuse me. How many people? On the approach. When I came in. A silence. I don't know the exact number. 7, Marcus said. 4 in uniform. 3 in maintenance gray. One of the maintenance workers moved to the secondary access corridor when my transport was 40 meters out. The other 2 didn't react. You might want to know why one of them did. He said it without inflection, without drama, in the way that someone mentions they noticed the weather. Then he picked up his bag again and looked at Oren with an expression that was approximately patient. Oren stared at him for a moment. Then he gestured toward the inner doors. Your quarters are this way. Senna had watched from the elevated gallery above the bay. She had gone back to her desk afterward and pulled up the bay security feeds. The maintenance worker in question had, it turned out, moved toward the secondary corridor because there was an equipment locker there that contained tools for the afternoon maintenance cycle, and she had simply been getting a head start. It was a completely ordinary explanation. It changed absolutely nothing about the fact that Marcus Cole, walking off a ship after a long transport flight, had clocked 7 civilians, identified a behavioral anomaly in one of them, and reported it conversationally before he had been told where his room was. The meeting with the Queen had been scheduled for the late afternoon. Marcus had spent the intervening hours walking the palace. Not a formal tour. Oren had offered one, and Marcus had said, politely, that he preferred to orient on his own. He had spent 4 hours moving through the public corridors, the gardens, the 3 main assembly halls, and the formal dining complex. Zaelith received him in her working office, which was not the grand throne room but a smaller chamber with actual functional furniture, a desk, chairs built for multiple body types including human ones. She had checked the night before and had a chair sourced from a human embassy on the third continent. The walls were stone, the same amber-gray canyon rock as the rest of the sunken palace. Bioluminescent moss grew in the cracks, giving the room a soft shifting light. She had planned several possible opening remarks. She had been in diplomatic proceedings for 40 years. She was very good at opening remarks. He walked in, scanned the room in that same flat professional sweep she would later come to recognize as involuntary, then looked at her directly and said, "Your Majesty, your inner courtyard has 3 unmonitored blind spots that I want to address before nightfall. Do you have 5 minutes now, or should I put it in writing?" She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, "Tell me now." He had told her, clearly, concisely, with the spatial precision of someone who thought in architectural terms. He had also, she noticed, spent most of the briefing with his back to the wall and his eyeline on the door, not in any obvious or theatrical way, but simply as a consistent background habit. When he was done, she said, "You walked the entire palace in 4 hours. The accessible sections. I'll need access to the service corridors and the lower levels. I'd like to meet your security staff, not for a formal briefing, just to see how they move, how they stand, how they watch, where their attention goes when something unexpected happens in their peripheral vision. You learn more from that than from personnel files." She studied him. He met her gaze without discomfort or affectation, the look of someone who was waiting for the next piece of information he needed, and was comfortable in the interval. "You come with very brief references," she said. "I find lengthy references are usually compensation for something." They mentioned Keshan Station. They don't explain it. Something moved through his expression, not a flinch. Too controlled for that. But a quality of stillness that was different from the one before it, as if a room had very slightly changed temperature. "It's in the public record," he said. "Station defense. Contested engagement. Unit lost. I was the only survivor. The files on it are classified. Some of them." He looked at the door again. Not away from her. Not uncomfortable. "Just checking. I did the job I was paid to do. That's what the references say. It's accurate." She let it sit. She had learned, over 4 decades, that silence applied to the right sentence was worth more than 3 follow-up questions. But Marcus Cole sat in the silence with the same patient flatness he had been maintaining since he walked in, and offered nothing into it. "All right," she said. "I'll have Senna arrange access to the service corridors. The security staff briefing can be tomorrow morning. Tonight would be better." She had not been told no in this office inn, she thought. Quite some time. She found, unexpectedly, that it did not bother her. Tonight, then, the Veth Covenant did not name their operatives in the way that most galactic cultures named their people. Covenant members carried designations, a combination of letters and a single identifying mark, tattooed onto the inner wrist. The operative who led the advanced scout unit that night carried the designation Velkrath, which in the old Veth tongue translated approximately as Edge of Patience, and his handlers had always found that appropriate. Velkrath had 41 confirmed operational terminations across 9 dominions. He had been active for 22 years. He did not get nervous. He had not gotten nervous in at least 15 years, which was around the point when he had begun to feel that the concept of nervousness was something that happened to younger operatives who had not yet accumulated enough experience to understand how completely most situations were manageable. He was nervous now, not because of the job. The job was clean target acquisition, standard Covenant work. The client was paying exceptionally well. The palace security was competent but not exceptional. His 40 operatives were the best available, and 3 weeks of surveillance had mapped the sunken palace's blind spots with precision. He was nervous because of the face on his tactical overlay. The confirmation had come in at 3:09 from his secondary scout team on the east perimeter. A facial scan, run against the standard Covenant records, and then against the restricted files, and then against the file that existed in a part of the Covenant's network that Velcrath had accessed only twice before in his career, both times feeling like touching something very cold that should not be touched. He had stood in the darkness of the palace's outer garden and looked at the confirmation readout for 45 seconds. Then he had opened the tactical channel to all 40 operatives. "Pull back," he said. "Full withdrawal. Authorization Velcrath. Confirmation code 77 Amber." A silence on the channel. His second, a seasoned operative named Torsen, said, "Commander, we are in position. Objective is, I know where we are. Pull back. Now." Another silence. Longer. "The client will be notified." He was already moving toward the withdrawal corridor, his boots silent on the garden stone. "Full withdrawal. I want everyone outside the palace perimeter in 10 minutes. Leave nothing." He dropped the relay unit 2 seconds before he remembered he had it in his hand. Force of habit, clear the site. He was already past the wall by the time he registered that the encryption on the dropped unit might be recoverable. He would think about that later. Right now, he needed to get his team out and put a call through to the Covenant's external advisors, because Velcrath had seen the restricted file, and the restricted file was not ambiguous. The restricted file said, in the flat neutral language of bureaucratic classification, Marcus Cole, human, Commonwealth 5th Response Division, retired, status, civilian contractor, restricted classification, Category 1 extinction level threat, standing directive, all active Covenant units, confirm identification, withdraw immediately, report to Coordination Command, do not engage. The last line, which Velcrath had memorized because it was unusual enough to stick. This directive supersedes all active operational orders regardless of origin or client status. He had issued 4 times in his career a withdrawal order in the middle of an active operation. He had never once done it because of a single individual. He put the call through to Coordination Command as his team assembled at the perimeter rally point, their weapons still holstered, every one of them quiet with the particular quality of quiet that professional operatives maintained when they did not understand what had just happened, but understood implicitly that asking questions right now was not appropriate. Category 1 confirmed. Velcrath said, when coordination picked up, Sunken Palace, Vreth Prime. He's the target's first guard. A pause, then the coordinator said, simply, understood, report to secondary location. Await further direction from Oversight. Oversight, not client, not coordinator. Velcrath noted the word choice as he walked away from the palace into the cool canyon dark. Oversight. Senna worked through the hour Orin had given her and 40 minutes beyond it. The encryption on the dropped relay was a standard Covenant cipher, which meant it was excellent, which meant she would not have cracked it on her own. But she had access to the Galactic Archive's cipher library, which contained 4 previous variants of the same cipher family, and variants had weaknesses. At 4:42 in the morning, the relay decoded. It was 41 lines of tactical data unit positions, movement protocols, an operational timeline, standard intelligence, exactly what she had expected. And then, at the bottom of the tactical packet, 7 words, confirm Keshan anomaly present, begin Phase 2, await. Senna sat in her quiet office in the belly of the sunken palace and read those 7 words for a long time. She pulled up her research queue and started a restricted search on the phrase. The archive returned 3 results. 2 were restricted. One was an academic paper from a xenobiology journal 2 years prior, discussing theoretical frameworks for extreme stress biological adaptation in human physiology. She flagged all 3 and put a priority marker on the restricted pair. Then she went to find Captain Orin. She found him in the war room, where he had been for the past hour, and she put her slate on the table in front of him and let him read the 7 words. He read them twice. Then he said, "What is the Keshan anomaly?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but somebody does. And somebody put their first guard in this palace very deliberately, and the Covenant just received confirmation that they succeeded." She paused. "Captain, I don't think this assassination attempt was ever about Her Majesty." Orin was quiet for a long moment. The war room hummed softly around them. the equipment cycling through its overnight protocols, the displays showing green across the palace security network except for 2 spots on the east perimeter where the Covenant's ghost signals were still fading. Brief the first guard at morning session. Orin said, "Everything we have." Senna gathered her slates. At the door. She paused. "Captain." He noticed a behavioral anomaly in one of the landing bay personnel within 30 seconds of arriving. He requested tonight's security staff briefing instead of tomorrow morning's. She kept her voice even and factual. "He is in the palace right now, at 4:40 in the morning, because according to the night staff log, he has been walking the service corridors since 2. Orin looked at her. "I thought you should know," she said. She went back to her desk and began reconstructing the Keshen Station incident from every public source she could find. By the time the sun came up over the canyon rim and turned the palace walls to pale gold, she had enough of a picture to understand why the Covenant did not engage. She also had enough of a picture to understand why this was not, in any way, finished. The morning briefing was supposed to begin at 7. Marcus Cole arrived in the war room at 6:30. Which Senna was fairly certain he did deliberately not to be early, but to have time in the room before anyone else arrived. He was standing at the tactical display, looking at the Covenant's withdrawal pattern when she walked in. He had pulled the overlay back to its widest view, so the palace perimeter was visible as a ring with 40 red markers distributed around it at precise intervals. And he was studying not the markers, but the vectors of their withdrawal, the angles, the pace, the geographic logic. "Same timestamp for all 40, he said, without looking up. 3:14. Senna confirmed. Single signal. Not a reaction. They received an order and executed it. He moved one finger across the display, tracing the withdrawal paths. Here and here. 2 units were within 40 meters of your outer garden wall. They stopped. Held for approximately 8 seconds based on your perimeter sensor data, then moved away at the same pace as the rest. What does that tell you? That they weren't scared. Scared people move faster." He straightened and turned to look at her. They were following a protocol they know and trust. The order to withdraw made sense to them. Whatever reason they were given for pulling back was sufficient. They didn't question it. A pause. That means the reason has a precedent. This wasn't the first time that standing order has been issued. Senna set her slates on the table and pulled up the decoded relay data. "I found this in the data fragment from the dropped relay." She watched him read the 7 words. His expression did not change in any obvious way, but the stillness that she was already learning to read as a signal, the slight temperature drop quality behind his eyes, appeared and held. "Keshen anomaly," he said, quietly. "Not a question. You've heard the term." "No." He looked at the phrase for another moment. "But Keshen is where I was 3 years ago. If they're naming something after it. They've been studying it." He touched the edge of the display. "Who is they?" "I don't know yet. The relay data doesn't identify the instruction source, only the instruction. Someone told the Covenant to begin a Phase 2 after confirming I was here." He said it with the same flat informational quality as everything else. But Senna heard the specific shape of what was underneath it. Not surprise. Not fear. Something more complex, the sound of a man who had suspected something and was now receiving confirmation of its shape. "The Covenant was looking for me specifically. They set up a threat against your queen so I'd be hired. And now that I'm here and confirmed, they're moving to the next step. That's my assessment as well. What does Phase 2 mean?" "I don't know yet." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. Then he said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." "All right. How much of what the Covenant knows about me is in your queen's files? Did she know about Keshen when she hired me?" Senna met his eyes. "She knew you were the sole survivor of a station defense incident. She did not know the full file. Does she now?" "I'm working on reconstructing it. Some of it is under galactic archive restrictions I don't yet have clearance to break." He nodded once, then looked at the doorway. "Someone in this palace is feeding information out. The Covenant didn't find me through luck. They knew I'd been hired before the contract was even finalized. That timeline is too tight for external intelligence gathering. It's internal." Senna had reached the same conclusion at approximately 4 in the morning, but had been waiting to raise it until she had more to support it. I agree. I found a listening device in your main War Council chamber last night, he said. I left it in place. Senna stopped. A device I remove stops transmitting. A device I don't touch keeps transmitting exactly what I want transmitted. He reached into his bag and produced a small sealed case. Inside the case was a device no larger than a coin, a dark wafer adhered to what had clearly once been a bolt head on an under-table support strut. I photographed it in place and then did remove it, because I needed to identify the hardware before deciding what to feed through it. But I've already pulled its transmit log. He set it on the table. It's been active for at least 8 weeks. Conservative estimate, based on the adhesive oxidation. Captain Oren walked in at 7 precisely, stopped when he saw the device on the table, and said, "Is that what I think it is?" "Yes," Marcus said, "and we have a larger problem." The larger problem was Chancellor Doral, who arrived at 7:20 with 3 senior court officials behind him and a level of righteous procedural's momentum that Senna recognized as the product of a sleepless night spent composing arguments. Doral was long-limbed and dark-scaled, with the smooth authority of a Vreth male who had spent 4 decades in positions of institutional power. His scales were the deep forest green of the old administrative houses, and he wore them with the awareness of what they signified. He had served 3 successive rulers of the Vreth dominion, and he was, by any reasonable measure, extremely good at his job. He was also, Marcus had told Senna at 6:50, the most likely source of the listening device. "I am requesting," Doral said, placing a formal document on the briefing table, "an emergency review of the First Guard appointment, on grounds of security ambiguity." Oren said, "The morning security briefing is currently. The morning security briefing has produced, as I understand it, a significant unauthorized surveillance device in the War Council chamber, which was accessible to the new First Guard during his unsupervised orientation walk yesterday." Doral's eyes moved to Marcus, and Senna watched the exchange with attention. Doral's gaze was precisely calibrated, neither hostile nor neutral, but the kind of measured assessment one gave to an obstacle one was planning to root around. Sergeant Cole's operational history is not fully disclosed in the public record. In light of the night's events, I believe the court has grounds to require full disclosure before continuing this appointment. My operational history is attached to the contract, Marcus said. The summary notes are attached. The underlying incident reports are classified. By who? Doral paused. The pause was brief, but Senna caught it. By the Galactic Archive, under Standard Military Incident Classification. Standard classification doesn't hold incident reports for 3 years. That's an extended hold. Marcus's voice remained even throughout. Extended holds require a named requesting authority. I'd be curious who requested it. Another pause. Fractionally longer. I'm not privy to the administrative details of archive classifications. Of course, Marcus said. He said nothing else. He did not push, did not underline, did not indicate in any way that he had just done something. He simply agreed and moved his attention back to the tactical display. Doral looked at him for a moment, then addressed Oren. "My formal request stands." After Doral and his officials left, Oren closed the briefing room door and said, "He's been on this court for 4 decades. "I know," Marcus said. "You're certain?" "No. I'm working on a 40-minute assessment and a listening device that could have been placed by anyone with access to this room. But the device was placed under the bolt strut on the east side of the table, the side where the Chancellor's seat is assigned, based on the placards still in position from last week's council session, and his response about the archive classification had a delay consistent with a question he wasn't expecting." He paused. "I could be wrong. I've been wrong before." The way he said it, not as a disclaimer but as a statement of plain fact, told Senna that he had, specifically, been wrong before in ways that mattered. She did not ask. Not yet. The Queen took the briefing in her working office. She sat through the presentation of the tactical data, the decoded fragment, and the listening device with the composed expression of a ruler who had trained herself to process alarming information without externalizing it until she had decided what to do with it. "When Marcus finished," she said, "the Covenant retreated because they recognized you specifically." "Yes, and you don't know why." "I know what Keshin Station was. I don't know what they think it was." He was quiet for a moment. "Someone has spent time building a file on me. Whatever's in that file is convincing enough that the Covenant's standing directive says to withdraw rather than engage. That's not a normal risk assessment. That's fear, or something close to it. Zaelith looked at him for a long moment, and Senna watched the Queen do what she did when she was genuinely thinking, the slight settling of her scales, the gold flickering at the edges of her amber eyes, which was a physiological response to elevated processing that most Vreth politicians trained themselves to suppress, and that Zaelith had stopped suppressing in her third decade of rule. "If the assassination attempt was designed to place you here," she said, "then the threat to me may not be real. It may be real for other reasons. A cover that's been put in place is still a cover. Real assassins make the best fakes." He paused. "I'd like to operate on the assumption that both threats are genuine until we have evidence otherwise. The threat to you, and the threat to me. The Keshan anomaly, whatever that means." Senna spoke up. "I've submitted a priority clearance request to the Galactic Archive for the restricted Keshan files. I should have a response within 24 hours. Zaelith said, "Make it 12. Use my executive clearance code." The Queen stood, which was the kind of movement that ended a meeting. Then she stopped. "Sergeant Cole." She turned back. "If this is, in fact, about you, if my life is being used as leverage over you, what is your assessment of your own situation?" He met her gaze. "Unclear. I don't yet understand what they want from me. But you have a theory." The stillness again, brief and telling. "I have several. I'd rather develop evidence before I commit to one. And if you had to commit to one right now," he thought about it, actually thought. Not the pause of someone performing consideration, but the pause of someone genuinely running an assessment against incomplete data. Someone thinks I have something they want, not something I own. Something I am, or something I know, or something I can do. They've spent enough resources to set up a prolonged operational scenario just to confirm I'd taken this position. He paused. People spend that kind of resource on things they can't get any other way, which means they've tried to get it another way and failed. Or they believe I wouldn't give it voluntarily. His eyes moved to the window, where the canyon light was warm and amber through the pale stone. "I don't know what I have that's worth all of this." He said it simply, without false modesty and without self-aggrandizement. The statement of a man who genuinely did not understand his own value to the people hunting him. Senna thought, that might be the most dangerous thing about him. The second attack came at nightfall. It was not 40 operatives this time. It was 22, and they came through the service corridor access because the listening device, still active before Marcus pulled it, had transmitted his orientation route through the service tunnels. Someone had sent a full briefing packet to the Covenant, and Marcus had been counting on that. He had been in the lower service corridor since 4 in the afternoon. Senna learned this afterward, from security footage and from Oren's debrief. At the time she was in the war room watching the sensor alerts fire in sequence, tracking Marcus's position through the tunnels as 22 Covenant operatives moved inward and 1 human moved to meet them. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. She watched the footage twice afterward and set it aside for a week before she was ready to think about it analytically. What the footage showed was not what she had expected based on the Keshan reports. Marcus did not fight the way the public academic discourse about the incident had implied: extraordinary physical force, endurance beyond human parameters. What she saw was something different. Marcus moved through the service tunnels with an understanding of the space built in 4 hours of orientation the previous day, and he used that understanding the way a structural engineer uses a blueprint. He knew which corridor intersections forced a group to compress into narrower formation, which ceiling heights limited movement, which valve junctions could be toggled to change the airflow and with it the acoustics. He did not fight 22 people at once. He arranged it so that at any given point he faced 2 or 3, while the others navigated a space that had been, in the preceding 8 hours, quietly reconfigured by a man who noticed where things were and thought about what they could become. He was wounded twice. A blade caught his left arm above the old burn scar and opened a cut that bled consistently through the later stages of the engagement. A projectile impact caught him in the right shoulder, a glancing blow, not penetrating, but significant enough to affect his movement. He did not stop. He adapted and continued. At 21:47, 14 minutes after the last engagement, he walked into the main inner courtyard and sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the bioluminescent moss and applied a field dressing to his arm with the focused economy of someone who has done it many times. Zaelith was there. She had refused to move to the secured lower chamber. To Oren's considerable frustration, she crossed the garden to where he was sitting. He looked up, assessed she was unharmed, and went back to his arm. She sat down on the wall beside him. Not the chair one of the guards had moved in her direction, the wall, which was, for a Vreth queen in a formal situation, approximately the equivalent of sitting on the floor. "How many?" she said. 22 came in. 11 are down in the service corridors. The other 11 withdrew. He worked the dressing into place. You let them withdraw. I needed them to report back. If they report back, whoever is running this operation learns what I'm willing to let them learn. He looked at her for a moment. There are 11 Covenant operatives in your service corridors who are incapacitated, but not dead. I'd recommend medical treatment before interrogation. You'll get better information if they're not in significant pain when you question them. She looked at him. The amber of her eyes was very steady. You planned this. Not all of it. The broad shape. You walked those corridors for 4 hours yesterday because you were setting this up. He was quiet for a moment. I walked the corridors because I needed to understand the space. What you set up when you understand a space, you set up options. You don't know which option you'll need until the thing happens. She looked at his arm, at the field dressing, at the way he held his right shoulder slightly lower than the left. You're hurt. I'm functional. That's not what I said. He met her eyes, and for a moment the flatness in his expression shifted into something harder to categorize, not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a distinction he had not expected to be made. The arm will close on its own with 6 hours under the dressing. The shoulder is bruised, not compromised. I'll be operational by morning. She was quiet, looking at the bioluminescent moss. I hired you to make a political point, she said. That is what I told Senna. I found the best available contractor, and I chose you to disrupt the conservative faction's attention. She paused. I did not consider that the best available contractor might come with implications. I didn't know I had implications. You still don't know what yours are. Not yet. She stood, then stopped. When you understand what this Keshan anomaly is, tell me before you decide what to do about it. Don't protect me from it by handling it yourself. He looked up at her. Your Majesty, I have been managed by people who believed they were protecting me for 40 years, she said. It is the most exhausting thing I have ever endured, and I will not have it from my own guard. A silence. Then Marcus said, very quietly, all right, on the Directorate's observation ship, currently holding position 40,000 kilometers beyond Vreth Prime's gravity, well in a sensor shadow between 2 debris bands. Director Myra Sion received Velcrath's Phase 2 confirmation and pulled up the surveillance feed from the palace's service corridor network. She was human, which was not common in her position, and she was aware that it was not common, and she had spent 11 years building the kind of institutional gravity that meant people stopped noticing her species when they looked at her and saw only the office. She watched the service corridor footage and made notes in the precise handwriting she had developed as a graduate student and never changed. Then she watched it again. He's working from memory of a 4-hour orientation walk, said her research lead, Dr. Tavan, who had the pale green scales of the Vreth scientific houses. He set all of this up in the time between his arrival and the engagement. Yes. She watched Marcus' movement through a corridor intersection, the specific way he positioned himself at a junction to force the approach vector he wanted. He's not fighting. He's solving. The Keshan data showed the same pattern. The Keshan data showed the same outcome. We don't have footage of the method. She paused the feed. He's letting 11 of them go. To control their report, he's controlling our information. She was quiet for a moment. We've been measuring him. He's measuring us back. Tavan said nothing. Sion set down her stylus. Phase 2 is on schedule, she said, but I want to revise the timeline. We've been assuming he would need more time to fully embed. He won't. She picked up the stylus again. Move the activation date to 4 days from now. She looked at the frozen image on the screen. Marcus Cole, sitting on a stone wall in a garden, applying a field dressing to his own arm by the light of bioluminescent moss, completely alone in the frame, with the same quality of absolute self-contained quiet that had appeared in every surveillance image they had compiled on him over 3 years. The quality that the research team had been unable to clinically categorize. The quality that had driven the entire project. "He's going to figure out where the order is coming from," she said. Kavan said, "In 4 days. Possibly before." She closed the feed. "That's why we're moving the timeline." The Galactic Archive's priority clearance came back in 9 hours rather than 12, a courtesy, extended to executive code requests from Dominion rulers, and Senna had the Keshan station file open on her desk by early the following morning, when the palace was still in the blue-gray light before sunrise. She read it 3 times before she called Marcus. He arrived in 6 minutes, which meant he had been awake and nearby. He stood at her desk, and she turned the slate toward him without saying anything, because she had been trying to find the right way to begin for the past 40 minutes and had not succeeded. He read it. She watched his face while he read. She had become, in 2 days, fairly attentive to the specific calibrations of his expression, and what she saw now was different from the neutrality she had catalogued. This was not the professional blankness he maintained during tactical briefings. This was the look of someone reading a document about something they had lived through that has been written by people who were not there, the specific quality of recognizing events in a description that nonetheless does not resemble the memory. The file listed 7 names first. Marcus Cole's unit, Sergeant Daria Voss, Corporal Eli Brandt, Specialist Tanya Ose, Corporal James Kwan, Private Drew Marchetti, Private Layla Okonkwo, Private Sam Reston. 7 names and 7 dates and 7 short casualty records, each one 3 sentences. After the names came the incident data, the timeline of the engagement, the station schematics showing the sections that had lost structural integrity, the Covenant's operational records, partially reconstructed 47 operatives deployed, 47 withdrawn or confirmed lost over the course of an 11-hour engagement, with the final hours unrecorded because there had been no surviving Covenant personnel to file a report. And then the outcome data. 312 civilian personnel recovered alive from Keshan Station's Life Support Corps. 1 Commonwealth soldier recovered alive. 1. Marcus set the slate on the desk. 47, he said. That's what the reconstructed data shows. He looked at a point past the far wall of her office, past the stone and the moss and the morning dark still sitting in the canyon outside. I didn't count. At the time, I wasn't. He stopped. I was aware of how many there were at the beginning. 78. I knew that because 78 came through on their first wave and we held the station core, and I lost Sam and Layla in the first 2 hours. He was quiet. After the first 2 hours, I stopped counting them and started counting the people I was keeping alive. Senna did not say anything. She had found, in the past 48 hours, that silence was not an imposition on Marcus Cole in the way it was on some people. He did not feel compelled to fill it, and he did not read it as hostility. After a moment he said, 47, yes, the Covenant's best, based on the operational deployment records. All 47 were senior rank operatives. The Covenant sent their advanced strike unit to Keshan Station. She paused. The public academic paper on the incident describes you as a statistically impossible outcome in an asymmetric close-quarters engagement. The paper's author argued that the result required a re-evaluation of human physiological capacity under extreme stress conditions. He looked at her. That paper, published 2 years ago, I found it in my initial search. She kept her voice level. The Covenant's Category 1 classification was issued 18 months ago, approximately 6 months after the paper was published. I believe someone read the paper and applied it to the field. They think I'm something I'm not. They think you are something unprecedented, which, from their data, you appear to be. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not. I'm just stopped again. Not looking for words, she realized, but deciding which words were the ones he wanted to say. I was the last one standing. That's not the same thing as being the reason the others fell. It just means I hadn't fallen yet. He paused. I made traps. I redirected airflow to compromise their suits' thermal regulation. I used the station's structural map to move them through corridors where I had sight lines and they didn't. I found things and turned them into advantages. He met her eyes. That's not a biological anomaly. That's being cornered and not dying yet. The post-incident medical scans don't agree with your assessment, Senna said, and she turned to the next page. She watched him read it. The page was technical dense with clinical notation, values for various biological markers that she had cross-referenced with a human physiology atlas. The ones she understood showed a body that had operated for 11 hours at parameters that should have triggered incapacitation by hour 3. Cortisol saturation well beyond the range associated with sustained function. Neural activity patterns in the motor and decision processing regions that the attending physician had described. In her notes, as atypical to a degree requiring specialist review. Pain receptor suppression not complete. Nothing close to complete, but significantly reduced in the kind of graduated way that suggested the suppression was adaptive rather than pharmacological. These scans were taken 4 hours after the engagement ended. Marcus said, "Yes, I was unconscious. Yes." He looked at the page for a long moment. "I don't feel different," he said. It sounded like something he had thought about before, not for the first time, not even for the 10th time. "I felt everything during it. I felt the cold and the pain and the fear. I threw up behind the reactor housing at hour 7 because my body needed to do something and there wasn't anything else to give it." He paused. "I was not superhuman. I was just not done." She looked at the final section of the file. "There's a last page." She turned to it. It was blank, not a scanning error, not a missing attachment, but a page with a classification bar across the top that read, in the standard archive notation for executive restricted documents, Omega clearance required. Content withheld pending authorization. Requesting authority. Galactic Preservation Directorate. Marcus read it. His eyes moved to the requesting authority line and stayed there. "The Galactic Preservation Directorate," he said. "I've submitted a secondary request. Executive clearance may not be sufficient." She had spent the past 2 hours learning about the Directorate. They operate under the Galactic Science Committee, but they have independent authority in matters of what they classify as galactic biological integrity. They've filed Omega holds on 11 other documents in the past decade. All 11 relate to species with what the Directorate categorizes as accelerating capability trajectories. Marcus looked at her. "They hold files on species that are getting stronger. That is a non-technical summary, but yes, and they held a file on me specifically. They held the post-incident biology page of a military incident report that the public version doesn't include." She paused. "Marcus, I think the Directorate is the oversight that Velcrath reported to. I think they designed the scenario that brought you to this palace." He was quiet. The sunrise was coming through her office window now, the canyon walls going from gray to pale amber. He looked very tired and very still. "That's what Phase 2 means," he said. "I believe so." He nodded once, slowly. Not the nod of someone accepting something unexpected, the nod of someone who has been carrying the shape of a suspicion for some time and has now received a name to put on it. "I need to find the Directorate's active surveillance point," he said. "They're not getting their data from the Covenant's reports alone. There's too much operational detail in the Covenant's adjustments for that. They're watching the palace directly. I'll help, after I speak with Captain Oren about Doral." He paused. "I want to wait until I have more before I take it to the Queen. You don't want to move on Doral until you know who he's reporting to." "I know who he's reporting to. I want to know the reporting structure before I close it, or whoever is above him goes dark." He moved toward her door, then stopped. "Senna, the 7 names at the beginning of the file." She looked at him. "Did you read them before you called me?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for reading them before." He left. Senna sat with that for a little while, with the morning light on her desk and the file open in front of her. 7 names at the top of a document that had turned one man into a galactic incident. Chancellor Doral raised his formal objection to the first guard appointment in the morning session, as Oren had predicted. He had added 3 additional grounds to his petition overnight, each carefully drafted to sound like procedural due diligence. and he presented them with the smooth institutional confidence of someone who had been winning procedural arguments for 4 decades. Queen Zalith let him present all 3. Then, she said, "The appointment stands. The grounds you've raised will be formally answered in writing within 48 hours. Chancellor, you are recognized for your service to institutional process." The formulaic close. The one that said, "I have heard you. I have decided. We are moving on. Next item." Doral said, "Your Majesty, with respect, the appointment stands," she said, not louder, not harder, exactly the same register, the same pace, carrying exactly the information it needed to carry. The decision was made, and the next person who spoke in this room would be speaking on a different subject. Doral sat. His expression was composed and absolutely neutral in the way that expressions in court proceedings were composed and neutral when the person behind them was doing significant work to maintain it. Senna, from her seat at the edge of the assembly, watched Marcus, who was standing near the main door in the position he had taken at his own initiative, not the formal first guard position, which was at the Queen's right shoulder, but a position near the room's primary entrance that gave him a clear line of sight to the entire assembly. He was watching Doral with the same flat, patient attention he gave to everything. She had not told him she was watching. She did not need to. She suspected he knew. Marcus found the surveillance room at 14-0. He found it the same way he had found the listening device, by asking, not what seemed out of place, but where would I put something if I were hiding it here? What was out of place was easy to dismiss. What was hidden on purpose required knowing how the hider thought. The surveillance room was in the sub-basement level of the sunken palace's north wing, in a maintenance section formerly decommissioned 2 years prior. It was accessible through a sealed service tunnel whose decommissioning seal had been broken and re-adhered with a compound that matched the original seal material's color, but not its mineral composition, a detail invisible to a casual scan, but not to a chemical sensor, and not to a person who pressed their thumb against it and felt the slightly different density. The room contained 3 things: a power tap linked to the palace's secondary grid, a relay node of a type that Senna later identified as commercially available but modified for extended-range encrypted transmission, and a camera array that covered the courtyard, the main assembly hall, the war room, and the outer garden. It had been recording for 6 months. Marcus photographed everything, left the room exactly as he found it, and went back to Senna's office. "They have 6 months of footage," he said. "Everything visible in the palace for 6 months. The relay is transmitting to a receiver outside the Dominion's sensor network." He set his slate on her desk with the photographs. "I need your long-range array. Tell me the debris bands within 40,000 kilometers of the gravity well." Senna pulled up the navigational charts. There were 3 debris bands. Marcus looked at them for a long time. "That one," he said. He indicated the band between 2 medium-density asteroid clusters, on the anti-solar side of the planet. "It's the only approach that gives both sensor concealment and a clear transmission line for the frequency the relay node was using. It's also the right distance for real-time monitoring without perceptible signal delay." She flagged the location and ran a passive sensor probe, the kind that read existing signals rather than emitting anything detectable. The probe took 40 minutes. The result showed exactly what Marcus had predicted: a power signature consistent with a mid-class research vessel, running on minimal emissions, in the debris band between the 2 asteroid clusters, 40,000 kilometers away. "Watching. We need to tell Her Majesty." Senna said, yes. He was looking at the sensor readout, and the expression on his face was a version of the one she had seen when she first showed him the Keshin file. But where that one had been the look of a man confronting a past he remembered differently than the record described, this one was something else. The look of a man who had identified the specific shape of the trap he was in. "What are you thinking?" Senna said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking that for 6 months. They've had footage of this palace. They've seen every person who walks through the visible sections, every meeting, every deployment, every security rotation." He paused. "And they've had it since 6 months before I arrived. Which means they were planning this before the contract was offered to me. Which means the contract was designed. The job offer, The reference notes from 2 independent agencies someone arranged for me to look like the obvious choice for this position. To get you here, to confirm the research. He met her eyes. Whatever is on that Omega page. Someone designed a 6-month operation to put me in a controlled environment where they could observe me without my knowledge. And they built it around your queen. Senna looked at him for a long moment. You could leave, she said. He looked at the sensor readout. Then he said something she had not expected. She told me not to handle things on my own. Senna blinked. Last night, in the garden. He did not look up. She told me not to protect her from things by handling them myself. That it was the most exhausting thing she'd endured for 40 years. A pause. She meant it. I know she meant it. Then we go tell her. They told her everything: the surveillance room, the relay node, the vessel in the debris band, the Omega page, and Marcus's assessment of the timeline. Zaelith listened, and when they were finished, she said, quietly, they used my court to build a cage around you, and Chancellor Doral, almost certainly, though I believe Doral's role is informational rather than strategic. Whoever designed this didn't need him to do anything except report. She was quiet for a moment. I want to move against Doral. Not yet, Marcus said. He has been passing information about my court for 6 months. At minimum, I know, but if we move on Doral now, the people he reports to know immediately that the channel is closed. They've been receiving footage from the surveillance room. For 6 months they know what a normal day in this palace looks like. The moment anything changes in the part they can see, they'll move to their backup plan. He paused. I'd like to understand the backup plan before I make them use it. Zaelith looked at him. You want them to believe they still have access. For a few more days. She considered it. The gold in her eyes pulsed once, slowly. I dislike the idea of Doral sitting in my sessions tomorrow morning knowing what he knows. I understand. But you're right. She straightened. Doral stays in place. The surveillance room stays active. We know where it is. We know what it sees. We can choose what it sees. The vessel in the debris band stays uncontacted. She looked at Marcus with a steady, level amber gaze. What happens in a few days? They move to the next phase. Whatever that is. And when they do, we'll know more about what they actually want. She was quiet for a moment. Then in a tone that was slightly different from her political voice, less formal. More direct, she said. Marcus, the things you told Senna about Keshin Station. The 7 names. He held her gaze. Said nothing. I read the file this morning as well, she said, after Senna told me it had come in. Another silence. I won't ask you about it, she said. I just wanted to say that I read the names, that I know who they were. He looked at her for a long moment, and the stillness in his face was different from any version of it Senna had catalogued. Not tactical blankness, not professional calm, something rawer and quieter and more fundamental. He said, Thank you. Your Majesty. It was, Senna thought, exactly what he had said to her that morning, and it meant exactly the same thing. The activation came on the 3rd day after the surveillance room was found, which was faster than Marcus had expected. He was in the outer garden at 6:00 when the palace communications system received a simultaneous broadcast to every active display in every accessible section. It was not a signal from outside the Dominion's communication network. It was a broadcast from within it, from a Galactic Science Committee authorization code, which gave it automatic access rights to every Dominion communication relay without needing to request permission. The broadcast was 11 sentences. Senna recorded it and transcribed it and brought the transcription to Marcus and the Queen within 4 minutes. It identified the sender as the Galactic Preservation Directorate, operating under Science Committee Charter Authority. It identified the purpose as a formal action under the Directorate's species, integrity. Mandate, a clause of the committee's founding documents that Senna had found buried under procedural language in a section of the charter that had not been invoked in 62 years. The species integrity mandate gave the Directorate authority to request, that was the word in the charter, request the voluntary submission of any sapient individual for biological assessment if the Directorate's scientific panel determined that individual's biological profile represented what the mandate described as a potential trajectory event requiring galactic evaluation. The broadcast requested the voluntary submission of Marcus Cole. It also noted, in its 10th sentence, that non-compliance would require the Directorate to pursue alternative assessment approaches, and that the Directorate's current operational capacity in the Vreth Dominion included resources sufficient to ensure that the assessment would be completed one way or another. The 11th sentence read, "The Vreth Dominion's cooperation in this matter will be noted favorably in all future Science Committee proceedings." Zaelith read the transcription twice, set it on the table, and said, "They just threatened my dominion." "Diplomatically," Marcus said, "in language that's technically a request. In language designed to sound like a request while being a threat." Yes, he was quiet for a moment. "They've shown their hand because they think they're already holding the winning cards. The Science Committee Authorization Code, the Mandate Clause, the operational resources already deployed in Dominion space." He turned the transcription over. "They're not wrong about the operational resources. How does this change your assessment of Doral?" Oren said from the doorway. "It doesn't. He's still informational. But the timeline has moved up." Marcus looked at Zaelith. "They've activated because they think you're about to send me away. The announcement of the appointment disrupted their original timeline. They expected more time to observe before I was exposed. The attack 2 nights ago wasn't Phase 2. My discovery of the surveillance room was. That's why they're moving now." Zaelith looked at him steadily. "You expected this. I expected something like this. You've been expecting it since the morning Senna showed you the Kashan file." He met her eyes and, after a moment, yes. She was quiet. The gold at the edges of her amber eyes went very still. "You should have told me. I didn't have enough. You should have told me." She said again, with the weight of someone making a point they had already established the right to make. "We discussed this." The silence between them lasted 3 seconds. Then Marcus said, "You're right. I'm sorry." It was, Senna thought, the first time she had heard him apologize for anything. He said it without self-punishment and without excessive elaboration. Simply, "You're right. I'm sorry." And then he moved on. "We have a few hours before they expect a response," he said. "I need to use them." What happened next was something Senna would reconstruct over the following weeks from her own memory. Security footage, and the account Marcus eventually gave her. She did not have all the pieces in the right order until then, because in the moment she was managing the counter-broadcast preparation and coordinating Oren's defensive deployment, and Marcus was doing something else. What Marcus was doing was going to see Chancellor Doral. He went alone, which he knew he should not have done, and which he did anyway, because there was a specific conversation he needed to have in a setting where Doral believed he had the upper hand, and the only way to create that setting was to walk in without backup. Doral was in his office in the Chancellery wing. He received Marcus with the particular poise of a person who had been waiting for a confrontation and had had time to prepare, which told Marcus that Doral had been watching the broadcast response with significant attention. "Sergeant Cole," Doral said, "under the circumstances, I imagine you've come to discuss the Directorate's request." "I have," Marcus said. "I want to know who in the Directorate you've been reporting to." Doral's composure did not break. It shifted the smallest calibration, a settling of scales so slight that someone watching from across the room would not have noticed. But Marcus was not across the room. "I don't know what you're suggesting. You placed a listening device in the War Council chamber 8 weeks ago," Marcus said. "You've been transmitting to a relay node in the sub-basement north wing, which has been broadcasting to a vessel in the debris band at 40,000 kilometers on the anti-solar approach." He paused. "I'm not here to turn you over to Captain Oren. I'm here because I'd like to know the name of whoever gave you the receiving codes for the relay node." Doral looked at him for a long moment. His composure was excellent, and Marcus appreciated excellent composure. "You don't have the authority to offer me anything." "No," Marcus agreed. "I'm not offering anything. I'm telling you what I already know and asking you to confirm a single detail." He held Doral's gaze. "The Directorate is going to move against this palace with or without your further cooperation. They already have what they needed from you. You've been extremely useful, and now you're expendable." He paused. "The name of your contact." Doral was quiet. The silence was the silence of a man doing a practical assessment. What does this person actually know? What leverage do they have? What does it cost me to give them what they're asking? Director Sione, Doral said finally. Myra Sione, the Directorate's field operations lead. A pause. She approached me 14 months ago, through official Science Committee channels. Through official channels. The committee has liaison authority with all Dominion chancelleries. Her initial contact was completely legitimate. His scales shifted slightly. The green deepening. I was told it was a standard biological monitoring protocol for Commonwealth contractors. Routine. And when you realized it wasn't routine. Doral said nothing. When you realized it wasn't routine. Marcus said. You stayed. The silence was different now. Doral said. Dominion relations with the Science Committee are complex. The infrastructure consequences of a dispute with committee authority, I understand, Marcus said. He meant it factually, not without judgment, but with the specific understanding of how institutional pressure worked on people who were not cowardly, but were nonetheless pressed against something substantial and chose the easier path. Thank you. He left, in the corridor outside the Chancellery wing. He paused and thought. Director Myra Sione. Human. He had not expected that. He thought about it for a moment, a human building an operational network to capture another human for research purposes. He thought about the Omega page, the Directorate's authority over species with accelerating capability trajectories, the fear that lived at the bottom of that mandate. He thought about what it would mean to be a human being who looked at the Keshen file and concluded that the human species was approaching something that needed to be controlled before it couldn't be. He thought about Keshen Station and the 7 names, and the fact that he had thrown up behind the reactor housing at hour 7. Then he went to find Senna. He gave Senna the message in her office. Not verbal written, using the cipher she had shown him 2 days prior for secure internal communication. The message was long and specific. It contained 11 separate instructions for 11 separate political and communication actions she would need to execute in a specific sequence, beginning 3 hours after his departure and continuing over the following 24 hours. Where will you be when I start this? Senna said. On the Directorate vessel. She looked at him. You're going to turn yourself in. I'm going to walk into a situation that looks like surrender. He folded the written copy and gave it to her. It's not. Marcus. She held the paper in both hands. They will not let you leave. That's what they'll think. He paused. Senna. The Directorate built their plan around a specific theory of what I am. They believe the Keshen data. They believe the Category 1 designation. They've built their entire scenario around the idea that I'm something extraordinary that they need to study. He met her eyes. I'm going to behave exactly like what they expect, and they're going to believe every second of it, and that's how I'm going to walk out. You're going to use the thing they're afraid of to control them. For long enough. He looked at the paper in her hands. Start 3 hours after I leave. Not before. Not after. The sequence matters. She looked at him for a long moment. And if the sequence doesn't work, then you have a formal diplomatic crisis on record with the Science Committee that forces at minimum a public review of the Directorate's mandate authority. You have Doral's testimony about the operational approach. You have a surveillance room full of evidence. He paused. It won't be enough to get me back, but it'll be enough to make what they did cost them something. I don't want the version where it costs them something and you don't come back. He looked at her, not with the flat professional expression, not with the tactical blankness, something quieter and more direct. I don't either, he said. I haven't wanted that in a while. He told the Queen at 9-0. He told her everything, the Doral conversation, the message to Senna, the plan. He did not soften it and he did not present it as already decided, though they both understood that it was already decided. He told her as a matter of record. Because he had promised her he would not handle things on his own without telling her first. Zaelith listened. The gold in her eyes was very still, and her scales had the quality of controlled tension she wore before making decisions she would have to live with. When he finished, she said, you're trusting them to be exactly as afraid of you as their file says they are. Yes, and if they're not, then I improvise. He paused. I'm good at that. She was quiet for a moment. I find that I am not comfortable with this plan. I know. I find that I also cannot identify a better one given the constraints. I know. She looked at him. When you get back, she said. Not if, when, a deliberate word choice. And he recognized it as such. And something in his face registered the recognition. When you get back, I want a full debrief. Not Oren. Not Senna. You. Directly. All right? And Marcus. She moved toward him, not physical contact. Not with a breath of her rank in a formal situation, but a stepping forward that closed the space between them into something less institutional. The 7 names. All of them. Tell me their names again. When you're back, so I can have them added to the formal record of Dominion service. She paused. They died protecting your people. They should be in the record. He stood very still. The gold light from the canyon walls was very warm. Darya Voss, he said, quietly. Eli Brandt, Tanya Osei, James Kwan, Drew Marchetti, Layla Okonkwo, Sam Reston. I'll have Senna write them down. She already knows them, he said. He sent his acceptance of the Directorate's request at 9:15 via official communication channel. The response came in 40 seconds, a set of coordinates for a shuttle rendezvous point, a time, a list of conditions framed as requests and not. He put on the same clothes he had arrived in, put his bag over one shoulder, and walked out of the sunken palace through the east landing bay. At the door, he turned back once, not at any particular person or any particular thing. Just back, at the amber-gray canyon stone and the bioluminescent moss and the light. Then he kept walking, on the shuttle to the Directorate vessel. The young Veth operative riding escort gave Marcus a visual assessment and then, with the particular expression of someone working up the nerve to ask a professional a stupid question, said, "You're really just coming on your own." "Looks like it," Marcus said. "You're not," the operative paused. "You know what the standing directive says about you. I've been told. You could have, 40 trained Covenant blades, I know. And you're just," the operative gestured at the shuttle, "sitting here." Marcus looked out the viewport at the debris band resolving into distinct rocks as they approached, at the mid-class research vessel that was neither the largest nor the smallest he had ever been on. "What's your name?" he said. The operative blinked. "Veltara. Veltara." He looked back out the viewport. "The standing directive is right to exist. I'm not going to disagree with the basic fact that I'm dangerous. I am. Most people are dangerous if you corner them long enough." He paused. "The directive treats that as a reason to run. I think the woman who put me on this shuttle treats it as a reason to study me." He looked at Veltara. "What do you think it's a reason to do?" Veltara had no answer for this. Marcus looked back out the viewport as the research vessel grew in the window. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, with the flat, patient attention of a man reading a space, finding its exits, its sight lines, its junction points. Director Sion met him at the docking bay. She was human, late 50s, with the kind of face that had aged into its authority rather than away from it. Gray hair cut practical and short, eyes that were a pale and attentive hazel, and they moved over him with an assessment he recognized as professional in the same way his own was professional, though from a very different field. She put out her hand. He shook it. "Sergeant Cole," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Director Sione," he said. She led him through the corridor toward the research section, and he walked slightly behind, and to her left and spent the time reading the ship. Standard mid-class research configuration main lab section forward. Crew quarters aft. Medical bay and specimen storage in the starboard wing. 6 crew visible in the corridors, which meant between 8 and 12 total based on a vessel of this class. 3 security personnel, identified by the subtle variance in their uniform configuration and by the fact that their eyes tracked him rather than the director. 2 junction points in the forward corridor that created a compressed approach if you were coming from aft. 1 emergency pressure valve at mid-corridor, accessible without a tool if you were within arm's reach of the manual override. He counted the seconds between each section door's sensor cycle. From behind him, a camera positioned at the junction between the main corridor and the medical bay access, a small light blinked steady red. Recording. Someone was watching this corridor in real time. Good, he thought. Let them watch. He followed Director Sioni into the research bay, sat down in the chair she indicated, and looked at her across the table with the flat, patient expression she would spend the next 12 hours trying to figure out. "Let's talk," he said about Keshan Station, and in the corner of the research bay, the monitoring camera's light blinked steady red, and from somewhere in the ship, the technician watching the monitor would later tell Sion what she would initially dismiss. And then 3 hours into the session, remember, with a chill moving through her carefully maintained composure, that he had walked in smiling. Senna waited 3 hours and 30 seconds. The 30 seconds were her own addition. The message had said 3 hours, and she was precise enough to honor the 3, and human enough to feel that 3 hours and 0 seconds left no margin at the edge. She started the sequence at 12:15:30. Sitting in her office with the canyon light coming through the window and her slate open to the first of 11 drafted communications. The first action was a formal communication to the Galactic Science Committee's Public Affairs Office, filed under the Vreth Dominion's executive seal, requesting a public review of the Galactic Preservation Directorate's invocation of the Species Integrity Mandate. The request included a full transcript of the broadcast, a timeline of the Directorate's operational presence in Dominion space, and a preliminary inventory of the surveillance materials recovered from the sub-basement relay node. The second action was a communication to the Commonwealth Embassy in the outer sector, flagged urgent, informing them that a Commonwealth citizen was currently aboard a Directorate vessel under what the Dominion was formally categorizing as a coerced submission under a mandate clause whose legal standing was under active dispute. The third action was a communication to 7 galactic news networks, sent from Senna's personal research credentials rather than the Dominion's official channels, inviting them to submit formal inquiries to the Science Committee about the current status of the Species Integrity Mandate and its application to individual human beings. The 4th through 11th actions were a sequence of carefully targeted communications to specific committee members, ambassadors, and scientific organizations who had, in the past 5 years, expressed public positions on the appropriate scope of the Directorate's authority. Not every action was going to land. Marcus had told her that in the message. The goal was not to win immediately, but to make the Directorate's situation complicated enough that their attention divided between what was happening on the vessel and what was happening in the broader political environment. Every communication that required a response from the Directorate or the Committee was a thread they had to track. Threads multiplied by 14-0. The Science Committee's Public Affairs Office had received 47 formal inquiries from journalists, advocacy organizations, and galactic civil society groups, because 3 of the 7 news networks had published preliminary reports and the other 4 had forwarded the invitation to their own contact networks. By 15-0, the Commonwealth Embassy had filed a formal observation notice, with the Directorate not a protest, but one step below a protest, communicating clearly that the next step was available. By 15:30, Senna received a communication from Director Sioni's office, framed as a clarification and, in fact, requesting the Dominion to pause its public communications pending a direct dialogue. Senna, read it. She forwarded it to the Queen. She did not respond. She began the 7th action. On the Directorate vessel, the session in the research bay had been running for 6 hours. Director Sion had approached it methodically. She had a framework, a structured assessment protocol developed over 3 years of Project Keshan's operation, refined through simulation, reviewed by a panel of 12 specialists. She had not anticipated Marcus Cole to be uncooperative. The coercion structure they had built was genuine. The Queen's safety, the Dominion's political exposure, the Science Committee authority. There was no rational avenue for resistance. What she had not anticipated was that he would be entirely cooperative. He answered every question, clearly, factually, in detail. He answered the timeline questions about Keshan Station in sequential order. With the kind of precision this suggested, he had the night catalogued in his memory, the way some people catalog geography, not with drama, not with reluctance, but with the flat accuracy of someone reading from a map of a place they know intimately. He answered the biological assessment questions without resistance, the neurological pattern self-assessment protocols, the stress response questionnaires, the post-incident recall inventory. He also, Sion gradually realized, asked a question in return for approximately every 3 he answered. Casual questions. Small things. How long had Project Keshan been running? How many people were on the assessment team? What was the specific biological marker from the post-incident scans that had first caught the directorate's attention? She answered some of them because they were not sensitive. Then she noticed that she had been answering them, and traced back through the session log, and found that she had, over 6 hours, confirmed the general configuration of the research operation, the approximate size of the project team, the timeline of the vessel's deployment, and the specific section of the ship where the primary research files were stored. She had confirmed all of these things in the context of what felt like reasonable information exchange during a structured assessment. She sat back in her chair and looked at Marcus Cole across the table. He looked back at her with brown eyes that had not changed register in 6 hours. She understood, with the particular unpleasantness of a scientist whose data has just told her something she did not want to know, that she had been doing information management rather than information collection for the past hour and a half. "You've been mapping the ship," she said. "Since I came aboard," he said. She was quiet. There was a complex feeling in that moment, not quite admiration, not quite alarm, but something inhabiting the territory between them. "What are you going to do with the map?" "That depends," he said, "on what you decide to do with me." She studied him. In 6 hours of direct assessment she had gathered significant data, enough to begin preliminary analysis of the neurological and biological questions that had driven the project for 3 years. She had also, she had to admit to herself, not gathered the things she had been most hoping to gather: the explanatory framework, the why. The Keshan file told her what Marcus Cole's body had done in 11 hours of extreme stress. It told her nothing about the experience of doing it. And Marcus's answers had been complete and accurate, and had told her, she realized, very little about the experience either. "Tell me," she said, "what you actually remember." He looked at her. Something shifted behind the brown eyes, not opening exactly, but considering whether to open. "You have the file," he said. "I have the data. I'm asking about the memory." A silence. He looked at the table surface. When he spoke, his voice had the same cadence as always, level. Not rushed, not reluctant, but with a quality underneath it that she had not heard in 6 hours. "I remember the cold," he said. "The station was losing thermal regulation by hour 4, and I was cold for the rest of it. I found a maintenance locker in the life support section that had 3 emergency thermal blankets, and I used all 3, and I was still cold." He paused. "I remembered Darya Voss. She was the last one I was with. She lasted to hour 5, which was longer than any of them. And she gave me her sidearm before?" He stopped. "She gave me her sidearm and told me to make it count. And I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say to someone, because when do you not make it count?" A pause. "But I understood what she meant. Not make it count like be careful. Make it count like there's a reason. Don't let the count be wrong." The research bay was quiet. Sione had, without intending to, stopped writing notes. "I wasn't afraid of dying," Marcus said. "I was afraid of the count being wrong. The 312 people in the life support corps. I was afraid of the number being 311 or 280 or any number less than 312. He looked up at her. "That's what I was doing, keeping the number at 312. Everything I built, every trap, every redirect, every decision about which corridor to flood and which to seal it was all for the same purpose. Keep the number at 312. Don't let the number change." Sion looked at him for a long time. The research bay hummed softly. Outside the viewport, the debris band was catching distant starlight and scattering it into drifting sparks. "The biological anomaly," she said carefully. "The neural markers, the cortisol saturation curve, the pain suppression pattern. What about them? They shouldn't be possible. The parameters suggest a level of sustained function under accumulated physiological damage that is." She searched for the right word. "That is unprecedented in the documented literature for any sapient species." "I know," Marcus said. "And I'm telling you why. Not because I was extraordinary, because the number was 312, and I wasn't done counting. Sione was quiet. She had spent 3 years building a project around the theory that Marcus Cole represented a biological inflection point, evidence that humanity was entering an accelerated evolutionary phase, one that would, left unmonitored, reshape the galactic power dynamic within 2 or 3 generations. She had been very certain of the theory. She was less certain of it now. "You think I'm wrong," she said. "I think you measured the output and built a theory backwards," he said. "I think the theory is compelling. I think the data supports it." He paused. "I also think that if you had asked any of the 312 people in that life support core why I kept going, they would tell you the same thing I just told you. Not because I'm special, because they were watching. And I didn't want to be the reason the number changed." Sione said, "That's not a clinical explanation." "No," he agreed. "It's a human one." Another silence. She picked up her stylus and set it down again, outside the viewport. The debris caught the light and drifted. "You've been cooperative for 6 hours," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because what you're afraid of is real. Not the specific thing, the evolutionary trigger. The accelerating trajectory, I don't know if that's real or not, but the fear underneath it is real. You're afraid that humanity will become something the rest of the galaxy can't survive." He paused. "I'm afraid of that too. Different version of it. I'm afraid of what people can become when the pressure is right and the count is wrong and there's nobody watching." Sione set her stylus down definitively. "Then what is the solution?" "Not this," he said. "Not capturing people and studying them in sensor shadows. Not building operational networks out of other people's courts. Not the mandate. Not the Category 1 directive. Not any of the infrastructure you've built around Project Keishan." He held her gaze. "The solution is the same thing it always is, when one species is afraid of another." She said nothing. "You talk to them," he said. "You tell them what you're afraid of. You find out if they're afraid of the same things. And then you decide together what to do about it." The communications panel on the research bay wall chimed. Then chimed again. Then 3 times in quick succession. Director Sione looked at it. Then looked at Marcus. "That'll be the Science Committee inquiries," he said, "and probably the Commonwealth Embassy. And depending on how far Senna got into the sequence before you noticed, somewhere between 3 and 8 galactic news organizations." The communications panel chimed again. Sione crossed to it and read the queue. 47 inquiries from journalists and public organizations. A formal observation notice from the Commonwealth Embassy. A request for dialogue from the Science Committee's chair. A preliminary broadcast flag from 4 news networks. "Your analyst," she said. "My analyst." He agreed. "You left her a sequence." "I left her 11 actions. She's very good at sequencing." Sione stood with the panel in front of her and the chiming continuing to build. And she made a decision that she had. She understood now. Been building toward for the past hour and a half of a conversation that had told her more about the Keshan anomaly than 3 years of medical data combined. "I'm going to need to manage this," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "While you're doing that, I'm going to need to go." He left through the starboard emergency corridor. Not because he had to, Sione made no move to stop him, and the 3 security personnel were fully occupied with the communications flood on the main bridge, but because the starboard corridor gave him a clean route to the docking bay that did not pass through any of the ship's monitored sections. And habits built for survival were worth maintaining even when survival was not in question. The docking bay held 2 Directorate shuttles and 1 Covenant escort vessel. The Covenant vessel's pilot was sitting in the seat with the flat attention of someone who had been told to wait and was doing it. Marcus looked at the pilot, Veltara, the young operative from the inbound trip, and Veltara looked back at him. "I'm going back to the palace," Marcus said. Veltara said, slowly, "I'm technically here as Directorate Security Support." "I know. The Director didn't authorize your departure." "No," Marcus agreed. "She's managing a communication crisis. She's not going to stop me." But she didn't authorize it. Veltara looked at the shuttle, then at Marcus, for a moment that had the specific quality of a person deciding which category to file something in. "Then, I'll fly you back," Veltara said, "on the record as a routine transport." "Thank you," Marcus said. He climbed in. through the viewport, as they cleared the docking bay and the debris band opened around them. He could see the research vessel beginning to adjust its position, turning slowly. The minimal emission profile coming up to active power as Psione brought the ship out of its sensor shadow. Going public, Marcus thought, or going for dialogue. He wasn't certain which. He thought it might be both. He thought about what he had said about fear and talking and deciding together, and he thought about whether he had believed it when he said it, or had said it because it was the right thing to say, and he found, which surprised him slightly, that he had believed it. He had meant it with the same plainness with which he meant most things. He looked at the planet, below canyon geography visible from altitude, as shadow lines cutting through amber terrain. The sunken palace somewhere in that grid of light and shadow, and he thought about 7 names. He thought. I wasn't done. He landed at 18.40. Senna was in the east landing bay when the shuttle came down, which he had not expected. She watched him walk off the ramp with her assessment eyes, cataloging the bearing, the pace, the arm with the field dressing still in place from 2 days ago, the right shoulder that still sat slightly lower than the left. Looking for damage. You're walking under your own power, she said. Yes. I've been told that's the standard marker for a successful operation. Reasonably standard. He stopped in front of her. How far did you get? All 11 actions. +2 I improvised in the 4th hour when the Science Committee chair asked for a formal statement of the Dominion's position. She pulled out her slate. The Directorate's mandate invocation is currently under formal review by the committee chair's office. The Species Integrity Mandate Clause has been voluntarily suspended pending the review. The committee chair made that decision 40 minutes ago. The Commonwealth Embassy has filed a formal position on coerced biological assessment that will be on record regardless of the review outcome. She paused. Doral is in a formal interview with Captain Oren. He's cooperating. His own assessment, apparently, is that the Directorate's operational situation is no longer one he finds it advantageous to support. That sounds like Doral. The Queen is in her working office. She has been there for the past 3 hours, refusing to do anything else until you returned. Senna looked at him. She didn't say that. She said she was reviewing session notes, but she has been reviewing the same note for 3 hours. Marcus looked toward the inner doors. Senna, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the title. She noted it. In the Keshen file. The last page. The Omega page. I think I know what's on it, he said. And I think it's going to be anticlimactic. In a good way. She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, I told Psione what happened at Keshen Station. The real version. And I think she believes me. He paused. If the Omega page says what I believe it says, it's going to be very difficult for anyone to justify the Directorate's project on the basis of it. What do you believe it says? He paused. Then post-incident biology report. Omega hold. Probably the attending physician's actual interpretation of the scan data. The one they suppressed because it didn't support the theory. He looked at the inner doors. The theory says I'm an anomaly, a biological outlier that needs study. He paused. I think the physician's report says I'm just a person who didn't stop. Senna looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her slate, where the Science Committee review was updating in real time. I'll submit the Omega page unlock request as part of the formal review package, she said. If you're right, it's the strongest possible closing argument. It's not an argument, he said. It's just what happened. She almost smiled. I know, that's why it works. She was right. As it turned out, the Omega page was unlocked 3 days later as part of the formal review process, and it contained exactly what Marcus had predicted, the attending physician's unfiltered interpretation of the post-incident scans, written in the clear, direct language of a medical professional who was not interested in theoretical frameworks and was interested only in what the data said. The physician's conclusion, after 6 pages of clinical notation, was this. The subject's biological responses during the engagement period are consistent with extreme stress human physiology operating within documented, if rare, parameters of prolonged adrenaline response and voluntary pain management. The neurological activity patterns, while atypical, fall within the range of documented anomalous stress responses in human subjects who have reported extreme motivational focus. There is no evidence of a capability threshold outside the established range of human biological potential. Assessment. This is a human being who did not stop. This is not the same thing as a human being who could not be stopped. The review panel released the physician's conclusion publicly as part of the mandate review proceedings. The Science Committee Chair, in her official statement, noted that the species integrity mandate had been invoked on the basis of data that the Directorate's own medical staff had assessed as within normal human parameters, and that this represented a significant misapplication of mandate authority. The Directorate's Project Keshan was formally closed. Director Sion submitted a formal statement acknowledging the operational overreach and requesting a structured dialogue framework for ongoing monitoring of human physiological research through voluntary, transparent channels. It was not everything. It was not the comprehensive policy shift that the problem deserved. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, Marcus had learned, were what you protected when you didn't have the time or the resources to protect everything. Zaelith was, in fact, looking at the same page of session notes when Marcus walked in. She set the slate down when she heard him at the door and did not pretend she hadn't been reviewing the same page for 3 hours, which he appreciated. He sat down across from her, not in the human configuration chair, in one of the standard Vreth ones, which meant his posture was not ideal for the seating but was fine. He had sat in worse and looked at her with the brown eyes that were very tired and very direct. "Sion," she said. "Not a question. She's cooperating with the committee review. I don't think she'll resist. She's a scientist. The actual data of the session gave her more than the coercion approach would have given her, and she knows it." He paused. "I told her the truth about Keshan, what actually happened, what I was actually doing, and I think she understood." A pause. "She still believes humanity is on an accelerating capability trajectory. I don't know if she's wrong, but she believed me when I said that the specific thing she found at Keshan wasn't the evidence she thought it was." Zaelith was quiet for a moment. The amber light from the canyon walls was going golden now, the late-day angle catching the stone at its warmest, and Chancellor Doral, cooperating, as expected. He looked at his hands. He was frightened by institutional pressure, not malicious. He made a bad decision that compounded over time. "I don't know what you'll do with him." "I know what I'll do with him." She said it with a finality that was not cruel but was very clear. "That decision is mine, not yours." "I know." She looked at him. The gold at the edges of her eyes was steady and warm in the amber light. "7 names," she said. "Darya Voss, Eli Brandt, Tanya Osei, James Kwan, Drew Marchetti, Layla Okonkwo, Sam Reston." He went very still. "I had Senna record them before you left this morning," she said. "They'll be added to the Dominion's formal record of service, with the notation that they died protecting civilians under Commonwealth protection." She paused. "It's not an equivalent recognition to what your own military would give them, but it's what this Dominion can offer." He sat with that for a long moment. The golden light moved on the canyon walls, slow and warm. "It's more than I expected," he said. "I've been told," she said, "that you expected to die when you took this job." He was very still. "Not from assassination specifically, but generally that you've been taking assignments that could kill you for 3 years, which is not the same thing as being reckless, but is also not unrelated." Her voice was steady, not accusatory, not pitying, direct in the way she was direct about everything. "Senna told me." She said you confirmed it. "The night you came back from the service corridor." He looked at her. "I told her I didn't want the wrong number version," he said. "That's not the same." "I know it's not the same," she said. "I'm telling you that I know. Not to discuss it or counsel it. Just to say that I know." She paused. "I also want to tell you that the count here is not finished." He met her eyes. "This court has a water reclamation expansion in the lower settlements that requires political breathing room I no longer have, because my chancellor is currently being interviewed by my security captain. And 3 positions on the infrastructure committee have become complicated this afternoon." She tilted her head slightly, a Vreth gesture he had learned meant something between irony and directness. I need someone who is good at reading spaces and understanding how things connect, and who is apparently capable of significant impact on the galactic political environment when properly motivated. She paused. I am not offering you the first guard position because it seems like a good job. I am offering it because this court needs what you do, and because I believe you know that a count doesn't stop just because the immediate crisis is resolved. Marcus looked at her for a long time. The amber light was very warm. The bioluminescent moss in the wall cracks had begun its early evening shift, the pale green brightening as the ambient light dropped. He thought about Darya Voss, who had given him her sidearm and told him to make it count. He thought about 312, and how the number still sat in him like something structural, a load-bearing thing, the kind you built the rest of the frame around. He thought about 3 years of jobs that were dangerous in the specific way of someone who did not care about the outcome for themselves, and how the past 6 days had, quietly and without announcement, shifted something in the accounting. The water reclamation project, he said. The lower settlements have been waiting 3 months. What does the infrastructure committee obstruction look like structurally? The gold in her eyes brightened, not a flicker, a sustained brightening. The full amber gold that meant she was fully engaged and had stopped calculating whether to show it. I'll have Senna brief you in the morning. Tonight would be better, he said. She looked at him, and then, for the first time since he had known her, she laughed, not loudly, not with great drama, but genuinely, with the particular quality of a laugh that comes from being surprised by something that makes more sense than expected. Tonight, she agreed. Outside in the canyon, the bioluminescent moss was going fully bright, the green running in slow waves through the cracks of the pale stone, and the stars were beginning to appear above the canyon rim, one by one, in the deepening dark. Marcus looked at them for a moment. 312, he thought, and still counting.